Good evening. Good evening. Welcome to the 2016-2017 Lectures in Catholic Experience. A special welcome to any of you who may be here at St. Jerome's University for the first time. We're very happy that you could join us this evening. And I want to extend a special welcome to Father Roger Jaworski and Father Bernie Carroll and some other members of the Jesuit community in Guelph who are here with us this evening, and this is the community that is supporting tonight's lecture. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinabek and Haudenosaunee peoples. This university is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. My name is Christina Vanine. I'm the Associate Dean here at St. Jerome's University, and I'm coordinating this year's lecture series. Before we get started, may I please ask that you check and make sure that all of your phones are off for the evening. Thank you. The calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, whether they are talking about children, education, health, justice, all of them point to the need to develop processes of reconciliation that understand and respect the language, culture, meanings, and values of Aboriginal communities. The TRC calls for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to be the framework of reconciliation, and for the Government of Canada to develop a national action plan and strategies and other concrete measures to achieve the goals of this declaration. We are consistently called upon to learn about the history and legacy of residential schools, to learn this United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to learn about treaties and Aboriginal rights, about Indigenous law, about Aboriginal Crown relations. We are also called upon to develop curriculum on how to integrate Indigenous knowledge into our classrooms, and on the need to respect Indigenous spirituality in its own right. And yet, how aware are we of these calls to action? How familiar are we with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? How do we engage in processes of reconciliation with honesty, respect, and integrity? This evening, we are so fortunate to have with us Sister Priscilla Solomon to help us understand a bit more some of the critical issues about reconciliation in our country, to help us to face what might inhibit some fruitful discussion and dialogue, and to invite us to consider what might lead to relationships of justice. Sister Priscilla is an Ojibwe of the Anishinabek Nation, and she is a sister of St. Joseph of Sault Ste. Marie. Her work in the Faith and Justice Office of her congregation has most recently focused on Indigenous rights, right relations, healing and reconciliation between Indigenous peoples and settler peoples in Canada, as well as on ecological justice issues. In particular, Sister Priscilla has been involved in Catholic responses to the TRC calls to action regarding terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery. She's worked with the Canadian Religious Conference's Justice, Peace, and Integrity of Creation group, and she's worked with Kairos on their responses to the TRC. Sister Priscilla also works with her own sister, Sister Eva Solomon, in the Western Assembly of Catholic Bishops Building Bridges program, which is focused on Indigenous inculturation and interculturation of faith. Her Aboriginal spirituality, her CSJ spirituality, and the new cosmology have all helped her to see the interconnectedness and the oneness of all of life in our common home, the earth. Sister Priscilla has been trained as an elementary school teacher, a spiritual director, a counselor, and she holds a master's degree in pastoral counseling. In June 2011, she received an honorary Doctor of Letters degree from Nipissing University for all of her involvement in work for justice. Please join me in welcoming Sister Priscilla Solomon to speak to us on the topic, integration, transformation, and reconciliation.
you. Could you watch the time for me? Thank you very much, Christina. Before I start, I just invite us to enter into a moment of stillness. I need to come to stillness within me, but for all of us, to be aware of in whose presence we gather and why we come together. Presence of our Creator, by whatever name we call that Creator or guidance in our life, that source of being beyond us. That we gather in each other's presence. And we gather in our own presence, each of us. So just to be still and honor that presence and give thanks. Thank you. And I would like to thank Christina for acknowledging the traditional territory in which we are gathered. And I also want to acknowledge and thank St. Jerome's University and specifically Christina for inviting me to come and speak with you. It's an honor and an opportunity. And I think it's also important at this time in our history as a nation for us to take these opportunities and make the best of them, to use them in the best way that we can. So I'm speaking tonight about reconciliation, what reconciliation is, why we need it, and how we're called by our faith to be reconcilers. When I shared with Christina what I was going to speak about, I know I spoke about integration. In this presentation tonight, I think what I'm sharing is my own personal integration, what I've been working with. But from an Indigenous perspective, the way our people taught us, our elders taught us, was to tell us the stories. And we were to draw our conclusions from those stories. So while I speak from an Indigenous perspective, from a Christian perspective as well, and specifically a Roman Catholic one, I'm aware that some of you in the room may not be Roman Catholic and that you belong to other faith traditions. But I believe that the desire for reconciliation and the need for reconciliation is common to all of humanity. And it's particularly essential in our world today. So I want to share with you something of what I've learned about reconciliation in my own life. And I'll speak a little later about the need for reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples of settler and immigrant origins in this land. And I do so in the hope that I can raise some awareness and also inform you of history from our present reality, and the call to transform our relationships through the work of reconciliation. Among my people, the Ojibwe and the Anishinabek it's a broader grouping that brings together the Ojibwe and other First Nations. But among our people and many other Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island, that we also know as North America, winter is the time of storytelling. It's a time to pass on the teachings of our people. And those teachings are sometimes presented in song, in legends, in dance, in myths, and in other times through personal stories. So tonight, I'm sharing some personal stories with you, and hopefully can provide some understanding of reconciliation. And what I share comes from both Indigenous and non-Indigenous perspectives. My own story is one of reconciliation. I grew up in a very small and isolated village, Killarney on the Georgian Bay. Some of you know it. It was a 99.9% Catholic community. Some of the people were of French-Canadian origin, others were of Anglophone heritage, and some were Indigenous. And it was in the pre-Vatican times, so the position of the Catholic Church at that time, the position at that time was that anything of Aboriginal spirituality and culture had to be rejected if a person was to become Catholic. And that was true of other churches as well. I grew up knowing that I'm Aboriginal, but not knowing my language, my culture, or anything about my Aboriginal spirituality. For years, I identified as a French Canadian, like my paternal grandmother, totally ignoring my Indigenous heritage from my other three grandparents. I believed that my Catholic faith in Jesus Christ was enough. I never realized that the church also gave me a culture that denied my Indigenous culture and reality. Only gradually did I recognize the contradictions and begin to know and accept my Indigenous heritage and reality. And several things came together to help me do that. When they were in their 40s, my parents seriously began their own personal journeys to reclaim their identity, spirituality, and culture, although Mom already knew her language. At that time, already a committed sister of St. Joseph, I had to struggle with my fears that they would lose their faith in Jesus Christ and they would face eternal damnation. Pre-Vatican II understanding. It's part of my story, part of my history, of my people as well. After several years of internal struggle, prayer, and reflection, I recalled Jesus' words, "By their fruits you will know them." I saw my parents carrying out the works of mercy and living the gospel, even as they attended church less regularly. They welcomed strangers and ex-prisoners. They fed and housed hungry people and lost people. They visited prisons and provided a safe place for hurting people to heal. I was able to reconcile my convictions and my faith journey with the fact that theirs was different, but no less right for them than mine was for me. I was then able to let go of my fears and open myself more to the journey that I was being invited to make. At the same time, my sister Eva was involved in studying Indigenous culture and spirituality. She was moving forward in her journey by claiming the truth of who she is. She encouraged me to do the same. In addition, in the early 1960s, Vatican II took place in the Catholic Church, and a new understanding of the relationship between faith and culture began to spread. You recognize that time. The Church recognized that God was also active in other spiritual traditions. Teachings on inculturation of faith were articulated and explored. Many Catholics, whether clergy or laity, began to understand that the gospel needs to be expressed in the deepest truths and best values of every culture, and that it must be lived and expressed through the culture of that people. The gospel cannot remain clothed in one culture and be imposed on another if it is to transform the hearts and lives of people. So there was an openness on the part of the church leaders and pastors to explore Aboriginal spirituality and cultural ritual and practices. Some reconciliation was happening because of this shift, but we still have a long way to go in the process. In the early 1990s, I was living in Thunder Bay, where I had been involved since 1982 in various workshops, retreats, and conferences focused on enculturation of faith. Sister Eva was now doing the work of enculturation in the Diocese of Thunder Bay and an annual provincial conference, and I worked with her at times. One day, an Aboriginal friend, Josie, came and said, "I have been in the CWL in my community for 25 years. The other members have always treated me as one of them, and in some ways, that's good. But they never acknowledge that I am Aboriginal, and therefore different from them in some ways. And that's been very disappointing. Now they have finally asked me to teach them something about my Aboriginal culture and spirituality. So I'm asking the two of you and Dr. Ed to come and do a day of reflection with me." We agreed, and the four of us led the day. It was an eye-opener for many of those women, but I think also it was the beginning of the process of reconciliation. Just ordinary, everyday lives That's where reconciliation needs to start happening. Later that year, I was home for holidays with my parents. And my father shared with me something that he was struggling with at the time. He had been asked to do some writing on Aboriginal spirituality, but he wondered if he should do it. He had already met many Indigenous elders who were concerned that some non-Indigenous people were going to ceremonies, like the sweat lodge and the pipe ceremony, then going away and conducting the ceremonies themselves. And often they did this as a way of making money. I remember Dad saying, "We said we would share about the land, and they took it. Then they took our children. Now they want our culture and spirituality?" He wondered if he should take the risk to share it. Yet he had many non-Indigenous friends for whom he knew that the desire to know was more. It was genuine. It reflected their desire to understand and to build new relationships. So he was torn. He was trying to reconcile his desire to share with settler people what was good and sacred to our people with the reality that it could be misunderstood or not understood and misused or abused. His concern made me more cautious. And the question of sharing our spiritual ways and wisdom also became my question. In 1993, I was preparing for a sabbatical. Two things I knew. I wanted to know more about my culture and spirituality, so I wanted to follow the medicine wheel that year. And I also wanted an answer to my question, should I be sharing my Aboriginal spirituality? And I decided that on that year, I would go in each of the 4 directions, following the pattern of the medicine wheel, and trusting that I would learn something through that. I wanted to start in the East, but I didn't know where. One afternoon, I was scanning an American Catholic newspaper for a retreat center in the East. I saw a small ad, 1 inch by 2 inches, and about 3 sentences long. The last line said, "Medicine wheel on the grounds." I knew instantly where I needed to start. So the night that I arrived there was in late September. It was raining and dark as we drove up the road to the center. We passed a cemetery just before we entered the gates. I saw it and I thought, I need to go there. For almost 4 months, I walked on the road, sensing that I needed to visit the graveyard, but never going there. Then on one of my last days there, I decided to go. I walked along the rows of graves, read every name, and prayed for every person in that cemetery. It was a very small cemetery. But that's what I did. As I walked, I was aware of the trunks of huge trees in the cemetery, but I never really looked up. I became aware that every grave was the grave of a soldier or someone young and non-Indigenous who had died during the Civil War. There were no Indigenous names. After I walked through the entire graveyard, I could have left, but I sensed that I couldn't go yet. Then in my mind, I heard the words, "Lie face down on the ground." I did so. I stayed there for a long time, feeling foolish and wondering what I was doing there, hoping that nobody would come by and see me. But I stayed there. Then in my mind, I heard the words, "Speak your truth, that our sons and daughters might live." And to me, that speaks to reconciliation. Speak your truth, that our sons and daughters might live. I had the answer to my question. But finally, I turned over, facing upwards. I saw that the leaves and branches of all the trees that I had experienced as separate trunks were intertwined and interconnected. I knew that below me, there was also a similar network of interconnected roots. I knew I was to continue to share my indigenous spirituality and culture because we are all interconnected, no matter how separate we may appear. I saw that we need the differentiation of the trunks. It is the reality and expression of the uniqueness of our cultures. Yet, by our very nature, we are interconnected. By our sharing, we can help each other. Then I was ready to leave. So as I walked up the road, I was reflecting on the absence of Indigenous grave sites, Aboriginal grave sites. At the top of the hill, I turned into the long downhill driveway toward the center. There was a huge grassy clearing, a big field on my left, and to the left of that was the medicine wheel. It was a really beautiful sunny day. I wondered where the Aboriginal people had been buried. Then surprisingly, I saw Aboriginal people dancing in a huge circle in the sunlight in the field. It was a round dance, it was radiant. It was so full of life and beauty. And it was so real and so lifelike that I just stood mesmerized. And I thought, I don't need to wonder where they were buried. Their bodies have become the very earth on which I walk. Their spirit lives on this land. They are here in spirit. As I was sitting in the little lounge this afternoon, looking out at the trees and the land, I was thinking, there are Aboriginal people whose spirit is here, who live on this land, who lived on this land. And maybe they're the ones we need to be calling on to help us in this process of reconciliation. So my experience tells me that it's important to really recognize and respect one's own experience. In some ways, it feels a little uncomfortable to tell my story, but it is my experience. I need to recognize it and honor it, and I hope that in sharing it, I help you to look at your story and reflect on where are these truths about reconciliation in my own story. It's also important to recognize and respect the other, each other's stories and each other's experience. So these personal experiences have guided my thoughts on reconciliation tonight. The thoughts that I'm sharing with you in the rest of this paper, some of them are ideas on reconciliation that are really very well articulated by a Father Robert Schreiter, a Catholic priest and professor at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. He began seriously writing and thinking about reconciliation in the early 1990s. And he's written the books Reconciliation, Mission and Ministry in a Changing Social Order, and his second book, The Ministry of Reconciliation, Spirituality and Strategies. And I find these two books a very rich resource. He and others present reconciliation as both a journey and a process. And that is what we're on, a journey together. We've had separate journeys, so how do we bring our journeys together? And it's a process we're involved in. Also, reconciliation is personal. And I think that's partly why I thought, I want to go back into my own story. It's personal to me, but each of you has a personal story too. It needs to take place in one's very being before it finds expression with others. And he also makes it clear that we do not initiate the process. While I chose to go on that sabbatical, I did not initiate the desire to go to the cemetery. I chose to go to that place. I didn't initiate the desire to go to the cemetery. It was there. I need to go there. And I didn't know where that need came from, but I didn't initiate it. I think that was God's invitation, the work of God's Spirit. And what I had to do was to sit down, to slow down, and to listen. I had to engage with my heart and follow the lead of the Spirit. I think those are important pieces of the process of reconciliation. To slow down and listen, to engage with our heart, and follow the lead of the Spirit. Reconciliation is truly a gift of God. Father Schreiter, in discussing the Christian understanding of reconciliation, says, "The experience of reconciliation is the experience of grace, the restoration of one's damaged humanity in a life-giving relationship to God, or with God." He also says, this restoration of humanity might be considered the very heart of reconciliation. As I speak, I get lots of other thoughts that I'd like to add on to it, but I know that it's going to delay the whole evening, and I have a lot presented here, but it was just that thought, the restoration of humanity. And we speak about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the calls to action that we have. They are calls to the restoration of a part of humanity, or the humanity of peoples that has been denied, that has been damaged. They're not just about things to do. They're about restoration of damaged humanity. The experiences I have shared with you were experiences of God restoring my damaged humanity, both directly and indirectly through others. God often finds instruments to guide us or to get us started in the process. So we need to be open and attentive, ready to receive the gift. Sometimes we ourselves are those instruments, or as St. Paul says, so we are ambassadors for Christ. Before I began my journey of reconciliation, I was happy with my Catholic faith and practices. I could have continued that way, but I would not likely be here sharing with you tonight if I had. My life would have gone on if I had ignored God's invitations, but would I have received the powerful answer to that question that I had if I hadn't gone to the retreat center? Maybe, but maybe not so profoundly. So I guess what I'm saying is that there was a sense that I needed to do something else to move forward in my journey. I needed to look at what I was happy with at the time. And that's a part of the process of reconciliation too, to recognize that the reality as I'm living it at this moment is not quite enough, even if it's satisfying. There's something more that can engage me with others that I need to look for. My experience in that cemetery and my vision of the indigenous spirit people dancing have grounded me. And they have reconciled me with myself and with my own reality in a way that I couldn't imagine. Those experiences freed me to face and to accept who I really am. They also brought me to the feelings of shame at the core of my being, feelings that I couldn't acknowledge, feelings of shame for being who I am. And that's a part of the reconciliation process, for us to own those feelings, either feelings of shame as Indigenous people for the way that we have been degraded or damaged in our own humanity, but feelings of shame on the part of non-Indigenous people as well, shame for a history that has brought us to this point. And we have to own those feelings, each of us, and process them. Father Schreiter says, "It seemed to me that reconciliation needs to be a way of living. It had to relate to the profound spiritual issues that reconciliation raises and requires." These calls to action are more than political. They're spiritual. They're relationship. And unless we can engage with them on the level of spirit as well, we'll be doing things, but we may not be reconciling. We need to be attentive to the voice of God's Spirit, and we also need to live in such a way that we are ready to receive God's gift of reconciliation. I've been sharing some of my personal story, but we also have a national story. The creation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was the response to the revelations of abuse at the residential schools. It enabled a public process which raised awareness in much of our mainstream society. Peoples of settler origins have learned and have begun to admit that many Indigenous people suffered incredibly and desperately, even some to the point of death, and not only from the residential school system. The work of the Commission brought more sharply into our consciousness the whole process of colonization and the need for decolonization. Aboriginal peoples had been trying to articulate the need for new relationships at least since the 1960s, with very little committed response from the established Canadian society that was benefiting from colonization. Also since the 1960s, some members and organizations of the Christian churches had been engaged in trying to address injustices toward Indigenous peoples. However, I think they may not have fully realized the extent of the damage done by the colonization process, nor how they themselves, and all Canadians, were implicated and embedded in the process of colonization. The 1992 critical incident at Oka was one of the triggers that woke up some Canadians of settler origins. More recently, in Ottawa in 2015, the TRC reported their findings of the residential schools. Through the public awareness that was raised by the 7 national events and many other local events, and its final report, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has challenged all Canadians, individually and institutionally, to engage in the process of reconciliation. And that's why we're here tonight. It's a deliberate attempt to engage in this process. So what is national reconciliation and why do we need it? I'd like to share with you an allegory. Like all allegories, or symbolic figures and representations of truth and human experience, it is limited. However, I think that it does point to more than 5 centuries long process of colonization and some of its tactics and impacts. It also shares a little of the resilience that has enabled Indigenous peoples to survive and to now call our nation to remember its basis in treaties, as well as to choose to live out of those treaty relationships. Indirectly, it expresses, and this is a quote, the cultural genocide and assimilation, a quote from the TRC report. It expresses them, and they are now recognized to be at the core of the colonization process. Those practices of cultural genocide and assimilation are some of the winds of change that are acknowledged in the allegory. And I think this is ready to work. Yep. The maple, an allegory. I'm not sure where I'm supposed to be pointing this. It was so long ago. She stood tall and strong now on the edge of the lake, and I just shut it off unintentionally. She stood tall and strong now on the edge of the lake, remembering. She could remember her relatives telling her so many things, things that had happened, things that were to come. When she was a sapling, her grandmother told her how many generations of her people had stood by this lake and soaked in the sun and the water. They knew all their relatives, and they heard all the stories, passing them on to their children. She herself had stood for a long time, for many moons. Much of the story was her story. She remembered cold winters. I'm not connecting with the equipment up there. Hmm? Yeah. What I didn't ask him is where to direct this. He's coming down. I'm pressing this one, and it's not, and I'm not directing. Did we? Okay. Where am I supposed to be directing at this? At the window. Okay. I'll aim it there. Thank you. Little essential bits of information. Those we gather in the process. That's what reconciliation does too. We gather it in the process. She remembered cold winters when snow covered her roots. And sometimes even her bare, it's not connecting. Sometimes even her bare branches. She thought about the first spring when the buds appeared on her branches, and she smiled. And the warm summers when her leaves rustled in the breezes. And the beauty of the fall colors. She remembered all the changes that happened. She remembered the terrible times when strong winds of change, tore away some of her beautiful and strong branches. She survived the shock and pain, but she would carry the scarred wounds. She lived on, even with the pain. She felt weakened and diminished by her losses. She hoped that there would be no more cold, bitter times. Surely something better was ahead. Over her head, the sun continued its journey in the ever-changing sky. Birds flew overhead. Some even nested in her branches. She lived on, dreaming and hoping. Years went by. Centuries passed. More destructive forces lashed out against her. She saw the old ones leaving. The things that the elders had talked about were happening. Great changes were taking place. Life was getting more and more difficult. On the shoreline, she watched the winged ones and the four-leggeds quenching their thirst, fishing and swimming. Two-legged sat in her shade, talking and telling their stories too. The two-leggeds canoed on the waters as they came and went. While she wanted to grow stronger and taller, she grew weaker and more confused, even as something else was happening. Or not happening. Her very security and her life were being threatened. The waters had begun washing away the very ground beneath her, leaving only cold, hard stones. The land was being taken away. Without land, where would she stand? How would she survive? Some of her roots were now exposed. Some who saw them thought they were dirty, ugly, and to be despised and rejected. Taken but determined, she said to herself, "They still reach deep into the earth, and they will continue to sustain me." She was glad others of her roots were so deep and so strong that nothing managed to damage them. They kept her firm, alive, and ready to face anything that came. She was thankful for the wisdom of her Creator. Yep, just not changing. She was old now, very, very old. Her bark was rough and dark. She was in deep pain and suffering and felt powerless to change it. But she continued to live and to give life. Not working. She provided a home. Now it's jumping. She provided a home for others, as her people always had. I'm not going to go back because I might not get moving again. I was a tree trunk with the hole in the side for animals to live in. She began to remember the stories of her elders and her prophets. She began to love as they had. Others began to reach out to her. Slowly, she grew stronger and healthier. Hope surged again. She was finding her way. She was no longer alone. She was happy, often full of joy, because her family began to gather close to her. Sometimes sadness overtook her. She knew she had other children, but they had been taken from her. She didn't know where they were. She remembered the day that it happened. She knew that the children of others were taken too. It had been so for many, many years. Still, she did not lose hope. Now young ones sprang up, fresh and green, promising a future. But haunting questions hung in her heart. Would she ever heal? What would it take to be free of the pain of the past? And the last slide was again the tree, the wounded tree with the missing branches. Sorry about the stuck slide presentation pieces, but I think the message is there. And that last question, what would it take to be free of the pain of the past? That's the Maples question. It's a question of not only redressing history, but of creating a new future. That is the question of Indigenous peoples and of caring settler peoples as well. Though the impact of this process is more obvious on Indigenous people, We know that settler people also have been diminished by the colonization process. We know that you too have not met your true potential, either as human beings or as citizens. We all have pain related to the past. We all need our damaged humanity and the dignity restored by the grace of God and by the goodwill and good actions of others. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has made it very clear that we need a change of mind and heart, and we need to begin to live very differently in our relationships. The Reverend Stan McKay, a residential school survivor, is quoted in the summary report of the Truth and Reconciliation speaking about this reality. He said, "There must be a change in perspective about the way in which Aboriginal peoples would be engaged with Canadian society in the quest for reconciliation. We cannot perpetuate the paternalistic concept that only Aboriginal peoples are in need of healing. The perpetrators are wounded and marked by history in ways that are different from the victims, but both groups require healing. How can a conversation about reconciliation take place if all involved do not adopt an attitude of humility and respect? We all have stories to tell, and in order to grow in tolerance and understanding, we must listen to the stories of others." That's the end of the quote from Reverend Stan McKay. It'll take a tremendous amount of healing for all, especially for Indigenous peoples, but it will also take a radical transformation. Reconciliation between Indigenous peoples and Canadians of settler and immigrant origins is the essence of that transformation. I have a few slides, if it works this time. What's on the slides is content of what I'm saying, so you'll hear it, but you may not see the slides. So I just want to reconciliation. Some of the things that connect with the first part of the Torah story. Reconciliation is gift. It's grace. It's our work, but it's initially gift and grace. It's the restoration of one's damaged humanity. National reconciliation is a need for transformation of our society and our own engagement with each other. The colonization process created a need for Indigenous and non-Indigenous settlers to reconcile. Reconciliation is both a spirituality and a strategy. The question, what is reconciliation? When asked that question, one Indigenous man said, and I've heard this from more than one Indigenous people, that there isn't a word in their language, but this man said, "In my language, we don't have a word for that. The closest thing I can think of is this. We speak of people working together to right a canoe that has overturned." Powerful image. The TRC summary report says, to the Commission, reconciliation is about establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship between Aboriginals and non-Aboriginal peoples in this country. In order for that to happen, there has to be an awareness of the past, acknowledgement of the harm that has been inflicted, atonement for the causes, and action to change behavior. Robert Schreiter says, reconciliation is both a spirituality and strategies. And what Schreiter says is about this need for reconciliation is that it exists in many, many social and political contexts in the world today. And we recognize that it exists in our Canadian context. He says, the reconciliation called for presents two faces. One face is social. It has to do with providing structures and processes whereby a fractured society can be reconstructed as truthful and just. It has to do with coming to terms with the past, punishing wrongdoers, and providing some measure of reparation to victims. Very similar to what the TRC said. Some of those expectations are the same. It must create a secure space and an atmosphere of trust that makes civil society possible. And this is continuing the quote from Schreider. He says, the other face is spiritual. It has to do with rebuilding shattered lives so that social reconciliation becomes a reality. Social reconciliation sets up conditions that make reconciliation more likely, but these conditions of themselves cannot effect it. So this next slide just kind of visually expresses the two faces of reconciliation. A social face, it's about structures and processes, and a spiritual face, it's about rebuilding shattered lives. It's about restoring human dignity. It's about restoring damaged sense of self. Although Schreider writes from a Catholic perspective, he doesn't imply that this is the only spirituality of reconciliation. He is saying, however, that some spirituality is essential to the process of reconciliation. So again, highlighting that it's not just doing. It's about who we are in relationship and who we bring into that relationship that's also important. Each one must engage according to their own spirituality of reconciliation, rather than rely entirely on structures and practices that are needed. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission identified the social conditions for reconciliation. It gave Canada and its citizens 94 calls to action. He says, he doesn't say, we can say that these 94 strategies help to bring about reconciliation. In and of themselves, they cannot make reconciliation happen. But perhaps we can say that they both describe and carve out the path on which we must journey together, with hearts and minds open and attentive to each other, and with the courage and the willingness to stay on the journey, even when the going gets tough, as it surely will at times. Besides pointing out the path with these 94 calls, the TRC also gave us the contours of the land through which we must travel. The shape of this new unknown land is the shape of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. If you look at it, it can look like a lot of words because it's all articles. It's more than words. It's the shape of the land through which we must travel. That's the framework. That's what they're calling us to engage in reconciliation in such a way that enables us to move forward according to the vision that Indigenous peoples have of the kind of relationship that we need to have with each other, because that's what this declaration is about. Indigenous people gathering with United Nations people to communicate what are the needs, what is the reality that Indigenous people are looking for in this world today. So that's part of what Canada needs to look at too. The Commission has made the declaration its framework for reconciliation in Canada. Its principles and values may well be the high mountains that we must climb. Let's not fear the effort. Now is the time to engage, not to shrink back in fear or discontent or indecision, or just saying, well, I don't know what to do about it, so let them figure it out. Or that's the government's work. It's much more than the government's work. In the allegory, the broken branches represent the shattered lives of Indigenous peoples and the destruction of the systems of Indigenous cultures, such as the clan system, and the systems for educating our people, our children, the systems for healing and curing the sick, for dealing with injustice in their societies, and whatever was needed to create a fully functioning society. Indigenous peoples today have the right and the responsibility to reclaim those structures and to find ways to use them within the context of treaty relations with other Canadians. Non-Indigenous Canadians have the right to maintain their structures for themselves, and they have the responsibility to ensure that their structures do not deny or eliminate or prevent from coming about Indigenous ones. I think peoples of settler and immigrant origins also have a responsibility to learn Indigenous ways of understanding coexistence and nation-to-nation relationships. A big piece of the reconciliation process is to learn to step into each other's shoes. And in actual fact, Indigenous people have been trying to walk in your shoes for a long time. The big shift that we're asking. And so it needs to take place, it needs to happen. We need to be able to share what we understand and need to be able to hear that. The roots of the maple represent the spiritual beliefs and traditions and rituals and ceremonies of the peoples. These too were shattered to some extent, and they were rejected. For Indigenous peoples, the process of reclaiming and restoring those spiritual roots is needed to be able to recognize, and to be able to recognize that they are of value to us today too. They're not just our past. They are the values and the spiritual traditions and beliefs that we need today to help us move forward. And for some of us, we need to integrate with our other Christian faith traditions. For non-Indigenous Canadians, the spirituality of reconciliation includes being able to recognize how Indigenous people's lives have been shattered and how their dignity must now be restored and respected. You also heard in the allegory about the taking of the lands and the children. For 150 years, generations of children were forcibly taken from their homes and put in residential schools. In the 1960s, under the assumption that the children's aid societies knew best how to care for them, Indigenous children were taken and placed in non-Indigenous homes. And some of you have heard about the 60s scoop. That's what it's called. Taken out of their own homes, their own cultures, their own context, because somebody else thought they knew what would be better for them. What happened was they lost their culture, they lost their traditions, they lost their spiritual roots. And they're now looking for those. Such colonizing actions fractured the Indigenous societies and cultures. And now those social structures need to be restored and repaired. And to do so requires new strategies. Creating these new strategies is a part of the work of decolonizing and the work of reconciliation. And we can't just wish or hope that change will come. Wishing and hoping isn't enough. We need to engage in the action. So I'm saying two things. We can't be just action. That's not going to get us where we need to go. We need a spirituality that goes with that action. But we also can't not act. We can't just wish and hope for it to happen or leave it for somebody else to do. The Truth and Reconciliation calls to action are very specific about many of the ways in which we need to act. And we can't ignore their recommendation that we use the Declaration as the framework for reconciliation. I think I shut this machine off, and I need it again. Father Schreider identified some steps in the process of reconciliation. Do you remember how I turned this on? I think the bottom one, eh? Yeah, got it. He identified steps in the process of reconciliation, and Sister Eva Solomon, my sister, has listed them and described them. And these are the steps. And she has focused particularly on the one forgiveness of self. But the steps are awareness. We need to be aware. The second is anger. The third is crying out. The fourth is creating a new redeeming narrative. The fifth is the forgiveness of self. The sixth is the forgiveness of the offender. The seventh is opening for repentance. And I think I'm just going to take a minute to talk about these, even though I didn't write it in. For Indigenous peoples ourselves, we have been coming to an awareness that we have been colonized. That isn't something that we've always been fully conscious of. We bought into it and lost in the process, but also lost the sense of our own agency, our own dignity, our own power to do something about it. So we were unaware. We've been growing in awareness that such a process has taken place, the process of colonization. And a first response is anger. When I talked about my parents in their journey, I remember going home and never knowing whether I would find a situation where my father was gathering with other Indigenous people who also were very angry about what has happened to our people and wanting to do something about it. So I heard and faced a lot of that anger. In the context of church work, I faced the anger of Indigenous people. I was witness to the anger of Indigenous people who said, Catholic Church taught us that we had to let that go. Now they're telling us you can have it back. And they were angry because of this vacillation, a totally different presentation. So there's a lot of anger. You will meet Indigenous people who are still very angry about this process. And so it's not like this is going to be an easy process for you or for us. The anger is there. You also, and I also meet non-Indigenous people, settler people who are very angry, that have just become aware or just becoming aware that some change needs to take place in our reality. Some change needs to take place in our relationships. And the anger's there, and it's sometimes expressed. You have to let it be expressed. The second step is crying out. From an Indigenous perspective, once that awareness came and the anger, the response of anger was there, we needed to be able to cry out. And so you heard a lot of angry Indigenous people, and you heard a lot of expression of the hurt that we've experienced. And you'll hear it for a long time, I think, because it is a process and it is a journey. And we're not all at the same spot in our journey, even though together we're moving on the journey. So it'll be going on for a long time. But you also, and I also hear this, non-Aboriginal people or settler people who have become aware of what happened in the process of our relationship over the past 500 years, and in that awareness have become very angry that this has happened. There's a lot of disbelief on the part of some non-Indigenous people that their ancestors could have done that kind of thing. There's also a lot of shame around that, but it's not recognized as shame. It's named as anger, not as anger, it's guilt. And in my own personal journey, I struggled with guilt and shame. And what I would be naming as guilt, I would be arguing with myself, well, but I didn't do anything, I didn't do that, I didn't do anything about that, so why am I feeling guilty? A lot of non-Indigenous people are saying, I didn't do that. I'm not responsible for this situation. I'm not guilty. But they still have this gnawing within that they don't recognize is the shame for what their ancestors did, their shame for their part in the process. That's part of the journey that non-Indigenous people have to face, this same reconciliation process you'll need to go through yourselves as non-Indigenous people. Creating a new redeeming narrative. Father Schreiter talks about the lie. And the lie is the narrative that was imposed by the other. So it was the colonizer's story about this relationship that got passed on, that you heard and that I heard. And the colonizing story was they're inadequate, they can't raise their own children, they can't, their medicine isn't good enough, they're not civilized. That's the story that was passed on. So the redeeming, or the narrative was that one people, settler people, got the advantage by sharing that narrative, by sharing that perspective of reality and ignoring the other perspective. Indigenous people bought that. We bought the story that you have something better to offer. And we let go of our practice, our spiritual practices, because we were told, if you want the relationship with the Creator, you have to let go of that and take this one. It wasn't thought out that clearly enough, but that was the message at the underlying level. That's the whole narrative in terms of the political, the social, the economic, the spiritual. That narrative is the one that we've believed on this land for 500 years. And we've been buying into it, and you've bought into it. You've been brought up in it. So for Indigenous people, we need to be able to say, I have roots. I have spiritual traditions. I have a history in this land that's significant. My ancestors live in spirit on this land yet. They're with me. I can move forward out of that cultural tradition. And I need to do that. And you as non-Indigenous people need to say, there were some mistakes made. We bought things in the story that are not quite accurate. We developed relationships that were superior or inferior. And so how do you bring your story, your new redeeming narrative into play? The one that says, we're equals, we're brothers and sisters. We need to relate together on this land. The next one, forgiveness of self. And I don't recall seeing that expression in Father Schreider's work, but Eva has worked with it a lot because she has talked about when you buy into the story, the narrative that you've been given, you realize you've been duped. And you need to forgive yourself for allowing that to happen. That was one of the steps when I was working with Indigenous peoples, the very beginning of the process of enculturation of faith in the Thunder Bay Diocese. They were very angry that they're being told a different story that they bought into. And now they were being told another one, and they had to recognize this new story has some truth to it that I need to listen to, but also they needed to forgive themselves for taking that other story. So we do need to work with forgiving ourselves. You as non-Indigenous people may need to forgive yourself for believing the stories that your ancestors passed on to you and taking those as truth for the relationships that we need to have. Forgiveness of the offender, the next step. For Indigenous people, that's clearly the step of forgiving non-Indigenous people who have offended our people and damaged the human dignity, damaged the sense of self, damaged the structures and relationships that exist. For you, there's also the need to forgive the offender. You need to identify who is that offender for you. And the last, opening space for repentance. And that's the ability, once you've been able to move through this process as the victim, if you want to call it that, but the one who has been offended, that's the one who begins the forgiveness process. That's where the process starts. It doesn't start with the non-Indigenous person. It starts with the one who's been offended, being able to open up, forgive themselves, forgive the offender, and then create the space for the offender to be able to recognize that, yes, I do have something to repent for, and I'm now ready for that. I'm ready to be engaged in the reconciliation process, engaged in acknowledging the offense and finding ways to move out of that into a new relationship. I don't know how much time I have, but 5 minutes. I just thought I didn't give any clarification of that in this presentation, and I thought maybe we need to talk about that a little bit more. So we as Indigenous people have to, and are going through this process, and it's a long process, it's a slow process, it requires patience and persistence. It also requires much from you as non-Indigenous peoples. You need to be aware, your own awareness, your own patience toward yourself and towards us, and compassion for us as well. You need to recognize that you've been given a distorted story too, and that you need to do something about that. People of my generation, and I see a few here who are of my generation, but people of my generation are familiar with the 3 R's, the 3 basics, which we could rhyme off as reading, writing, and arithmetic. There are 3 basics to reconciliation as well, and they are recognize, respect, and reconcile. Bring that up. Recognize, respect, and reconcile. And these do, I think, encompass, it's not moving, they encompass the 7 steps that I identified a few minutes ago. With the word recognize, I mean we need to recognize each other and the separate journeys that brought us to this point. We need to recognize the imbalance and injustice in Canada's history. And as long as Indigenous people continue to live out of the kind of experience that my friend Josie had, where for 25 years, as an Indigenous person, she could be present and her reality was not acknowledged, as long as we continue to live out of that, as long as we're seen as incompetent or as lazy or as drunks and addicts, as long as Indigenous peoples and communities remain not much more than news items and a cause for pity, rather than people that we engage with on a one-to-one in a community relationship basis, as long as our political leaders are seen as troublemakers or resistors to progress. Some of them are seen that way in relation to the pipelines and the extractive industries, and Indigenous peoples around the world are seen that way. They're considered to be getting in the way of progress. As long as we're seen that way, we're not being recognized for who we are. We need to respect each other and value each other. Respect means to recognize the dignity of the other and to work to restore that dignity when it's been damaged. It invites us to take a second look, to see beyond the externals to the truth of who the other is. And we'll all benefit from a society that can do that. And reconciling. To reconcile is not just to patch up or to do a fix-it job. It's not the kind of job that we have ahead of us. We need to engage our minds and our hearts. We need to face both our past and our future with integrity and courage. We need to engage in a conversation, a process of transformation that will enable us to help restore the damaged humanity and dignity of the other, and at the same time create structures that will bring about nation-to-nation relationships envisioned by the treaties. And I think we're in a graced moment of time. We are in an opportune time, a time of danger and a time of possibility. There's an Anishinabek prophecy called the 7 Fires. We had an oral tradition, so there are a lot of versions of this, and there are other First Nations who share the story, even though it's the Ojibwe people who identify it as their journey. But it's a story that's significant to other Indigenous peoples as well. Every version of the story speaks of 7 prophets and 7 sacred fires in the journey of the Anishinabek. The coming of settlers to this land was prophesied. It also speaks of an 8th fire to come, an 8th era in which Indigenous peoples and settler peoples will sit at the same fire and engage in new relationships. I think that's now. Now is the time of the 8th fire. And now is the time that we need to engage. Let's not miss this opportunity for reconciliation. I'd like to share with you my dad's poem, and it is his recounting of the 7 fires. In times gone by, the Ojibwe religious teachings tell us 7 major prophets came to the Anishinaabe. Each prophet left with his people a prediction about what the future would bring. Each of these prophecies was called a fire. Each of these fires referred to a particular period or era of time. Thus, the teachings of the 7 prophets are called the 7 fires. The first fire tells us that the Ojibwe nation would rise and follow the sacred shell. The religion would serve as a rallying point for the Anishinaabe, and the traditional ways in the Medewan religion would be the source of much strength. The second fire tells us that the nation would be camped by a large body of water. And this time, the direction of the sacred shell would be lost, and the religion would be weak. It was said that a boy would be born to point the way back to the traditional ways. He showed the direction to the stepping stones of the Manitoulin Island chain. Here, much rebirth of religious beliefs occurred. The third fire tells us that the Ojibwe people would find a path to their chosen ground, a land to the west in which they must move their families. The fourth fire tells us of the coming of the white-skinned race. The fifth fire relates to us a great struggle that was to come. The sixth fire tells us that during this time, grandsons and granddaughters would turn against their elders, and the spiritual ways of the Ojibwe would almost disappear. It all happened. The seventh fire tells of the emergence of a new people that would retrace their steps to find the sacred ways that were left behind. The water drum would again sound its voice. There would be a rebirth of the Ojibwe nation and a rekindling of the old fires. At this time, the light-skinned race would be given a choice. If they would choose the right road, then the seventh fire would light the eighth and final fire, an eternal fire of peace, love, and brotherhood. If the light-skinned race would make the wrong choice of roads, then the destruction which they brought with them on coming to this great island would come back to them and cause much death and suffering. This is the story of the 7 fires. And he wrote that in January of 76. I think we are at the time of the 8th fire, the time when we have the choice to make. Do we want to work together in love, in brotherhood, in learning to reconcile with each other? Or do we just continue on our old ways? And if we do, we don't have a good future ahead. Because a piece of the Indigenous reality is also the connection with the land. The spirit of our people are in this land. The spirit of the Indigenous peoples all around the world are in their lands. And they're trying to protect those lands, trying to protect those waters. If we ignore this opportunity for reconciliation, I think we continue to move on that path that we call progress, but it's not really where we need to go, is it? Let's take this moment, this time for reconciliation to really engage in the process. Hopefully this has been helpful to you, and I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
So Sister Priscilla is open to conversation and questions. So we have 2 microphones up there and 2 microphones down here, so feel free to make your way down. Okay? I'll let you.
Thank you so much for such a touching story. There were 2 aspects, an easy one and then a harder one. The easy one is the story of the tree. You touch on a social emotional learning that we do in schools. If, with your permission, that story would be perfect in schools ages or grades 1 to 6, where they have this passion. And the story made me realize, and this is my story, my journey with my kids at school. We are all one. We need to have heightened consciousness to this aspect. So with your permission, this story could go into all the schools and could be read to the kids so that they realize that they are one. Just that little girl, there was a YouTube on went viral a couple of days ago about a girl saying, I don't think the animals want to go into the oven. So that was part of, again, the environment. So that's my request, please, if we can send the story to schools.
Well, I haven't put it together. This is the first time I put it together, just as a way of trying to get away from all of the technical recounting of colonization to how do we hear that story in a way that isn't threatening to us, but a story that does express the tremendous damage was done by this process. But there is a groundedness and a resilience within the indigenous people that is also there. And there's still the openness to providing home, to providing a relationship. The questions are there.
Thank you.
So,
the second one is 25 years ago, we came to this country. And my eldest daughter, Grace, got a scholarship to go do her PhD in water resource engineering. And she decided to do her thesis on women and water in England. And one summer she came and she asked me to take her to the indigenous or native center. She asked two things. She said, I want to buy anything. If I want to buy anything, it has to be straight from the women who worked it. The second thing was she wanted to go to a museum where she learned more about the women, indigenous women, and water. And there was a museum, and it showed how the water was poisoned and the whole story. And I stood there and I said, oh my God, I came from a country where we have 10,000 years of pride in our history. The first alphabet to the world went from the Phoenician country. And I come here, I feel so ashamed of the history. And inside me, the voice, even Grace, told me, Mom, you're a teacher, you have a job here. And your story, you've talked, probably there's what, 100+ people here? We all heard you. If each one of us brings this awareness to our children, our neighbors, and then the grassroots movement, plus what Mr. Trudeau is trying to do, hopefully they will get somewhere. I feel so hurt. I feel so ashamed of that history myself. And I feel responsible to do something about it. I write a lot about the purposeful citizens, and I lecture about the purposeful citizens. We all need to be that purpose, on that purpose, where we have heightened consciousness towards all life, respect. You said everything, and it just hurt, it just touched home so bad. So good, actually, because I feel bad about this. One of the most, when I count some of the good moments of my life was when we landed in Canada. I was so happy. But when I knew this, when I saw that, I did not feel very happy. But now hearing that people like you are trying to reconcile, we forgive ourselves. We try to do something through education, because education is the only tool that will change. And hopefully, good luck on your trip. I join you, and I hope everybody else can join you in this. I want to feel proud of a Canadian, of being a Canadian. I want us to reconcile and do good towards the Indigenous people who we really hurt.
And to walk together with Indigenous people. Yeah. Thank you very much. And you're welcome to share what you heard tonight. I just haven't put it in any kind of structural form that's public education kind of material, but I appreciate hearing that you found it a helpful tool for learning that could be helpful for children, because we really do need to start with our children. That's where the colonization process of Indigenous peoples had a very strong grounding, was what happened in the education of the children and what happens in the education of our children today. in a way that, in stories like that, it's easier for them, I think, to grasp what we're being called to than kind of an academic presentation for them. So thank you very much, and hopefully I've responded to your question satisfactorily. I appreciate your desire for reconciliation.
Sister Priscilla, could you say something about your work with the Kairos blanket exercise and with schools and school children, and say a little bit about what a with not for approach means moving forward?
A little bit about the second part?
With not for.
Oh, okay. The blanket exercise, I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it is an excellent tool to engage people on an experiential level with the colonization process, to become aware of the history of what has happened to Indigenous peoples in this land that helped to bring us to the point that we're at today. It was developed by Kairos after the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples as a way of public education. It has really taken kind of fire and been used in many, many places across the country now at all levels. Kairos has a blanket exercise for children from grade 1 up to grade 6 with very simplified presentation. And then it has adult level, grade 6 up to grade 8, I guess is where it could be used. Then it has a teenage and adult level exercise that really invites people to get on blankets that represent the land and experience the process that took place. Hear what some of the laws were put in place that have brought us to this position. So it's an excellent tool. Kairos, as an organization, has developed a facilitators training program for people to be able to offer the exercise. And there are people in Kairos, in the Kairos organization, that can be contacted to help to present the blanket exercise. So that can be done in the schools, it can be done in parishes, it can be done in different community groups, wherever you would want to have people experience and be able to dialogue about the experience of colonization, the impact on Indigenous peoples. Karen, I forget the second part of your question. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I really didn't have that consciousness articulated for myself for most of my life, but I was invited to be on the Kairos Indigenous Rights Circle. And back in 2011, we had a gathering, Kairos Indigenous Rights Circle gathering in North Bay at our mother house. And Kairos is the coming together of a variety of churches that initially had different justice organizations. They came together in this one organization called Kairos, which has now focused its priorities on two different areas, one of which is Indigenous rights, and one of it connects with ecological justice. But the circle gathered in North Bay, and the Kairos team had been working on an annual campaign basis. Focus on one issue, do a campaign, raise awareness across the country, and focus on another one the next year. And the other was that they did the planning and then went to the different groups to process it. At that gathering, and Karen was at it and I was at it, that's what happened. There wasn't really much time for the plan to be put in place for the coming year. And but they brought that plan, and they also brought the 5-year plan for Kairos because they did some 5-year planning. And with the Indigenous people, the whole circle is not Indigenous people, but with the Indigenous people who were in the circle, it felt very much like this organization wants to do something for us and they want to work with us. And they're unintentionally speaking for us too. So what we need to do is not for you to come with a plan for us, but to come with us to develop a plan together, to be engaged in that process. And that's really a piece of what reconciliation is. You can't do a plan for reconciliation with Indigenous people without engaging Indigenous people. And that's a piece of what that experience was for me and for other circle members. We need to be together from the beginning in this process and work together on it. And it was very much a sense of working from the perspective of we want to do justice for the Indigenous people, and not realizing that it's more important to be able to say we want to do justice with Indigenous people, with those people who are fighting for justice in these particular areas. We want to work with you. So that we developed in Kairos the kind of a key expression, with, not for. And that's what reconciliation is. That process is a process with, not for. We can't do it for you we as Indigenous people can't do the process for you, neither can you do it for us. We need to work together in the process of reconciliation. That helpful, Karen? I just kind of, I think, to articulate that kind of relationship that we need to have.
Thank you, Sister. I was just wondering if you came to the answer of your father's question and your question about sharing your culture and how you integrated your own spirituality with your personal beliefs.
I came to that answer when I was in that cemetery. I did have the answer for my question, because my question was, should I be doing this? I was being invited to engage and to share. My answer was, I should, for these reasons. We're joined, we're one community. We're a human community together. I have something to offer and you have something to offer, so I needed to be able to share that. So I did come to the answer to that. I've been trying to integrate it ever since. And integration is a kind of a messy process. It's a one step forward and a couple steps back and another one to the side. And I like the expression that we understand our lives when we look back. Because I think I have been trying to integrate my own spirituality, my Indigenous spirituality, and my Roman Catholic spirituality. But I also recognize that I don't live in an Indigenous community. I live in a non-Indigenous community. My time is spent a lot more with non-Indigenous people. So I keep having to face the fact that I still am not as deeply rooted in my own Indigenous spirituality as I need to be, or as I would like to be. It's not as well integrated for me yet as I'd like it to be. But I'm not going to give up on the process. I do smudging. I smudge, and I've gone to sweat lodges. I do attend. I haven't attended any lately. I do have a sacred pipe, so I do some of the ceremonies, and I do engage in some of them. But I know that I don't go enough into those opportunities. You talked about water. I've gone to a number of different water ceremonies with Indigenous women, and water is very significant to the Indigenous women because we see water, caring for water, as our responsibility. So a lot of the strong voices on caring for water and protecting the waters in this land are the voices of Indigenous women. You may have heard of Josie Mandaman, an Indigenous woman from Thunder Bay. She said she was at a gathering of Indigenous people one time, and one of the people who was there was an elder. And he was speaking about the challenge that we as Indigenous people have to be able to recognize our responsibilities to the water and to the land. And it's easy for us to move out of our own spirituality and our own relationship with the land and the water into a culture that offers us an awful lot. You have brought a lot to Indigenous people. There's no denying that. It's easy for us to get caught up in that story. And she said at that talk, she recognized that she was not caring for the water and that it was her responsibility. And she said, I went home And I opened my cupboard under my sink, and I found all these bottles of containers that are destructive to the water. I took them all out, got rid of them all. And then as she began to explore her responsibility toward the water, she began to walk for the water. She walked around Lake Superior with a group of Indigenous people. She has walked around the 5 Great Lakes. She initiated a walk from each of the 4 directions that met, I'm not sure if South Dakota, I think, at the headwaters of the Mississippi is where they met. And I was at a gathering with her just recently, and she said she doesn't have a lot of formal training, but she knows her responsibility as an Indigenous woman to care for the water and to speak for the water and to speak with the water and to offer reconciliation to the water for the way in which we have treated it. So she's going to be doing another walk in the future that they're filming an ad for it, but I'm not sure. I haven't heard the details about it. But I'd like to be able to be as integrated as that, but I'm not yet. Very open, very open. She invites, we all depend on the water. We all need to care for the water. Whoever will walk with her, she will invite, she will welcome and will walk with her. And non-Indigenous people have walked with her and have publicized her work as well.
Thank you. Sister, when you started your story, you talked about your sabbatical and wanting to go in the 4 directions, the sacred 4 directions. You mentioned you wanted to start in the east, but you didn't mention whether you went in any of the other directions. So what happened to that?
It was a very blessed year. I did go in all the other directions. And I had plans, but there were other plans that took. I really believe that God's Spirit works in us. And that's what Josephine says. I don't plan. I don't make arrangements. The Spirit will work, and I just need to respond. I did go in other directions. I went from the state of New York, where that retreat center was. I had planned to go to New Mexico. I got an invitation from one of the priests of the Hamilton Diocese that I knew from Thunder Bay. And he had worked in Guatemala, and I had worked in Guatemala. He was taking a group of people to Guatemala, and he asked if I was interested in going with people from his parish and a couple of seminarians and priests that that were going on this trip. So I went much further south than I anticipated. But when I went there, I was able to reconcile some of my previous experience in Guatemala and to recognize how significant that experience in Guatemala was to help me to recognize the truth of my own reality here in Canada and the relationship with Indigenous people here in Canada. And then I came up from there, I came into New Mexico. I arrived at the place where I had made arrangements to visit a convent and some sister friends. The night that I arrived, a sister from the Apache Nation came in. She said, "And when are you coming to visit me?" She invited me to go to her place, and I went with her for a week. 3 days into my visit, she came home. She had to work during the day. She came home and she said, "I have this flyer. I don't know how it came to me, but you might be interested in it." And she handed me a flyer, and it was the first Healing Our Spirit Worldwide conference that was taking place in Alberta, Western Canada, in July. I hadn't even heard of it. I had no intention of being there. When I saw the flyer, I took that as God's on this journey with me. Maybe that's where I need to go in the West. I was already planning to go and visit family in the West. That was a part of my sabbatical, to spend time with my brothers out there. But I mean, I was being guided in that. I went to that Healing Our Spirit Worldwide conference, and it was an incredible experience. I have a lot of stories around that. I can't tell them all tonight, but they're really stories of experiencing God working in ways that I couldn't imagine, that I couldn't anticipate. But thank God I was able to be open to those experiences and to move with that. And in that experience, I made connections with some people in New Zealand that I had never anticipated ever connecting with. I came full circle, and I wasn't going back to the Diocese of Thunder Bay. I figured that my the coming back to the north would be coming back to Northern Ontario. And I had the experience of being invited back into the Diocese of Thunder Bay, where in that experience, and I don't even remember what the actual experience was, but it was the experience of coming back into the very setting in the situation in which the woman had said to me, I've been 25 years in the CWL and they have never recognized that I am Aboriginal or different, and I have another story to bring to this gathering. It was a reconciliation of that experience even, so it was full circle. And then moving on into the next circle. So yeah, wonderful experiences. And that's one, I guess, the realities of sabbatical time is you do have the freedom to be able to do that. It's a heck of a lot harder for me to do that in my everyday life that's so active and so busy, but I recognize that that's really what I need to do. It's that slowing down and being open to the Spirit that will help me to respond. And certainly when I come to take advantage of opportunities like this, it's not because I think I have a tremendous amount to offer, but because I think God is in this process. God desires this reconciliation far more than I do or any one of us does. If I'm being invited to contribute the little piece that I can to it, that's all that God is asking of me. So I'm willing to do that. So thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah.
So I would like to invite forward Father Bernie Carroll from the Ignatius Jesuit Center to formally thank our speaker on our behalf.
Priscilla, I've known you for many years. We directed retreats back, was it the early 80s? And it was before a time when you spoke in this way. And I knew that you were from an Aboriginal, Indigenous family and background, but you were not speaking of those things in those days. And then a little later on, I met your father, and I knew your sister, and they had begun. And I remember some of your father's anger when he would speak of the hurt and the pain and the anguish and so on. But also there was a sense in which he also spoke a truth, you know. Well, he was speaking a truth, but it was often in that context. And I remember some of the other Jesuits that I worked with. I happened to have worked up in the mid-north, up in Espanola, in that area, with working with Indigenous people and the training of Indigenous deacons and so on. And at the time, I remember some of the other Jesuits saying, well, what's he saying about, because he didn't grow up as a Native person, and he didn't, and so on. And it's so good to hear you find your voice. And you've shared many things with us tonight, and there's so much that we need to learn, and we need to learn. And I've learned something, but I think I've learned most, and perhaps what we've most learned tonight is hearing you tell your story. And in telling your story, it heals us. It encourages us to look at our stories and to find this route in this journey to reconciliation with one another. So thank you. And I think that whole sense is truly a spiritual journey, because there is a spirit in the world, a spirit, whatever, that wants to divide. We hear it all the time, but it works even in our own hearts, that wants to keep us divided and not to be reconciled. But the spirit of the Creator, the spirit of the one who has given us all life, is one that wants to call us to reconciliation and to oneness. And so that spirit wants to give a voice to what needs to be said in order to call us all to reconciliation and to renewal. And what were those three things that you mentioned? To respect and to recognize and to be reconciled. So thank you.
Thank you, Father Bernie. Just a couple of announcements before we finish up the evening. First of all, I want to sincerely thank the Jesuit community for its ongoing commitment and support for this lecture. And again, thank you to Father Roger, Father Bernie, and some other members of the Ignatius Jesuit Center community for being with us this evening. We send out regular emails about upcoming speakers. If you're not currently on our mailing list and you want to receive information about these lectures, as well as other lectures and events that take place here at St. Jerome's, please feel free to sign up in the atrium. There's a sign-up sheet at the front on your way out the door. Every year, St. Jerome's University is pleased to present a program of speakers to the community and to make them available to you free of charge, and we're able to do this because of the generosity of many partners and supporters. If you too would like to support the lectures, the same table where you can sign up if you're not on our mailing list, there are some donation envelopes available. And again, I always want to thank everyone who gives so generously to supporting us here. There are a number of wonderful fairly traded products available for sale by our Social Justice Committee, so stock up. You'll be back in a few weeks, but you know, between now and then, you might want some coffee and chocolate. Our local independent bookseller, Wordsworth Books, is with us this evening, so please make sure to visit their table in the atrium. The next lecture in Catholic Experience is going to take place on Friday, February the 10th, and it is entitled 52 Minutes of Silence, Finding Words for the Inexpressible. Mary Hines is the host of Tapestry, CBC Radio's award-winning weekly program about spirituality and the search for meaning. So on February 10th, Ms. Hines will talk about how this religion beat can be the most rewarding and the most frustrating subject matter in journalism. The conversations that she engages in can be profound, provocative, hilarious, and heartbreaking. But how exactly does one write headlines for the inexpressible? So come on February the 10th and hear what Ms. Hines has learned about this relationship between religion and the media during her 14 years as host of Tapestry. I also want to tell you about another important event coming up next Tuesday afternoon. In this year, 2017, St. Jerome's University is hosting a year with the St. John's Bible. This Bible is the first handwritten and illuminated Bible commissioned by a Benedictine abbey since the invention of the printing press over 500 years ago. We are fortunate to have with us 2 volumes of a 7-volume heritage edition of this Bible with us for the year. We also have framed prints for you to see of some of the illuminations. So on your way in, you might have seen that there is 1 volume on display in the atrium. That's the volume called Gospels and Acts. The other volume is on display in our other building. We have the volume Pentateuch with us. And I will, when I go into the foyer, back into the atrium, I will open up that display case so you can get it even up close and personal with this volume. So next Tuesday, January 24th at 4:30 p.m., we are having an ecumenical prayer service to officially welcome and launch this year with the St. John's Bible. So I invite you to come back, join us here in Vanstone Lecture Hall as we gather together with our colleagues from Conrad Grebel, Renison, University of Waterloo, St. Paul's, and Waterloo Lutheran Seminary to celebrate this incredible work of sacred art for our time. And in fact, at that event, if you come back, you will have the opportunity to see 5 of the 7 volumes of the St. John's Bible, because we're grateful that the Diocese of Hamilton is going to be bringing up 3 of its volumes. So it's a lot of beautiful sacred art for you to see. And there will be parking available and some refreshments. Finally, I want to thank all of you for coming this evening. As always, it's wonderful to have you with us. And I thank you for any ways in which you might be spreading the word about these lectures and bringing new people here to St. Jerome's. I look forward to hopefully seeing some of you next Tuesday afternoon, and maybe all of you back on February the 10th. But for now, have a safe trip home this evening, and until next time, good night.